My name is Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old, and last Sunday night my parents invited me over for dinner. If someone had driven past their house on Maple Ridge Road around 7 that evening, nothing would have seemed unusual. The porch light was glowing warmly against the darkening sky. My father's truck sat in the driveway beside my mother's sedan, and the living room windows spilled soft yellow light onto the lawn. From the outside, it looked like any quiet family evening in a small Texas town. But the moment I stepped through the front door, something felt wrong. The first thing I heard was the sound behind me, sharp and final. The deadbolt slid into place. I turned immediately, my hand still holding the strap of my purse, and saw my father leaning against the door. Ronald Carter had always been a large man, the kind of man whose presence filled a room even when he said nothing. His shoulders were broad from decades of construction work, his arms folded across his chest in a posture I recognized too well. It was the stance he took whenever he had already decided how a situation would end. He didn't greet me. He didn't smile. He simply stood there, blocking the only exit. For a moment I tried to convince myself it meant nothing. Maybe he had just locked the door out of habit. Maybe I was imagining the strange tension creeping up my spine. Then I looked toward the dining room. The table was already prepared, but not the way it usually was for our family dinners. My mother had covered it with a white tablecloth so smooth it looked like it had just been ironed. 2 tall candles burned quietly in the center beside a vase of white lilies I had never seen before. Their sweet scent, mixed with the faint smell of melted wax, filling the room with a heavy sweetness that felt oddly formal. And sitting at the center of that perfectly arranged table was a stack of papers. 6 pages clipped neatly together. A black pen rested carefully on top. Across from the empty chair waiting for me sat a man I had never seen before. He looked to be in his early 40s, dressed in a dark blazer and a crisp shirt, as if he had just come from a business meeting. He sat comfortably, one ankle resting over the opposite knee, watching me with a calm expression that suggested patience rather than curiosity. When our eyes met, he nodded politely, the small professional nod strangers give each other in elevators. Like we had already been introduced. Like he already knew why I was there. A knot tightened slowly in my stomach. That was when I noticed the second man. He was sitting quietly in the corner of the living room near the bookshelf, almost hidden by the shadows. He looked older, maybe 60, with thinning gray hair and a leather folder resting neatly on his lap. His suit jacket hung slightly loose on his frame, and when he realized I was looking at him, he offered an uncertain smile. It was the kind of smile people give brides before weddings. Suddenly, the entire room felt unfamiliar, like I had stepped into a scene that had already begun without me. My mother appeared from the kitchen just then, wiping her hands on a dish towel with the bright, satisfied expression she always wore when she believed everything was going exactly according to her plan. Patricia Carter loved appearances. She loved control even more. "There you are, sweetheart," she said warmly, as if this were the most ordinary evening in the world. "We were starting to think you'd gotten lost." She walked toward the table and gently pulled out the empty chair across from the stranger. "Come sit," she said, gesturing toward it. I stepped forward slowly, my eyes drawn to the stack of papers lying in front of the seat. The title at the top of the first page was printed in bold, unmistakable letters: Marital Agreement and Covenant of Union. My name had already been typed neatly at the bottom of the last page: Emily Carter. Underneath it was a blank line waiting for a signature, my signature. And that was the moment my mother looked straight at me, her voice calm and certain, and said the words that made my blood run cold. "Emily, tonight you're getting married." My mother's words seemed to settle over the room like a weight no one could move. "Emily, tonight you're getting married." For a moment, the entire house felt strangely quiet. The candles on the table burned with soft, steady flames, and the faint scent of lilies filled the dining room. From the kitchen came the low, familiar hum of the refrigerator, the same background noise I had grown up hearing in this house. Everything about the place looked exactly the same as it always had. The furniture hadn't moved, the walls still carried the same framed family photos. Yet the room suddenly felt different, as if I had stepped into a scene that had already been planned long before I arrived. I didn't sit down. Instead, I stood there looking at the stack of papers on the table, my name already printed neatly at the bottom of the contract. A Sunday dinner invitation had somehow turned into something that looked more like a business arrangement than a family gathering. My mother watched me carefully, her expression patient, almost satisfied. She had that calm look she always wore when she believed everything was under control. "You look surprised," she said gently, as if the situation were perfectly reasonable. "But honestly, Emily, this was going to happen eventually." Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had already decided how the night would end. But my thoughts had already drifted somewhere else. I was thinking about my apartment 20 minutes away. It wasn't anything special. A small one-bedroom place above a laundromat on the edge of Harrison County. The hallway always smelled faintly of detergent and warm cotton from the dryers downstairs. Inside, the carpet had faded to a dull gray, and the air conditioner rattled whenever it started running. But it was quiet there. Quiet in a way my parents' house had never been. Every month I paid the rent myself with the paycheck I earned, working as an accountant at a small trucking company outside town. Most days were spent staring at spreadsheets, balancing fuel receipts, tracking repair costs, and organizing delivery invoices. It wasn't the kind of job that impressed people at dinner parties. But it was stable. And more importantly, it was mine. That simple fact had never meant much to my mother. Patricia Carter had always believed that success was measured by appearances, by the things neighbors whispered about at church gatherings or family cookouts. In her world, a woman nearing 30 without a husband wasn't independent. She was embarrassing. The phone calls had started years earlier. At first they came once a week, then twice. Eventually they arrived almost every other day. "Where were you Saturday night?" she would ask the moment I answered. "Who were you with? Are you still working at that accounting job?" She never called it my career. It was always that job, spoken with a faint note of disappointment. Sometimes she didn't even bother hiding what she meant. "Emily," she once said during one of those calls, her voice cool and direct, "do you know what people are starting to say about you?" Over time, I realized something about that sentence. People almost always meant her. Thanksgiving the previous year had proven that more clearly than anything else. She had insisted I come home for dinner, calling repeatedly until I finally agreed. I remember walking through the front door carrying a pumpkin pie I had bought on the way over, trying to believe the evening might actually be peaceful. But before I had even set the pie down on the counter, my mother turned toward my aunt and said loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "This is Emily, still single and still working at that little office job." She laughed, as if it were harmless. Most of the table followed her lead. My father didn't laugh. He simply sat at the head of the table with his hands around a coffee mug, watching the conversation unfold without saying a word. That was how he handled almost everything in our family. He rarely argued, rarely raised his voice. Instead, he let silence do the work for him. And somehow that silence always seemed to support my mother more than any words could have. Standing there in the dining room now, with a marriage contract waiting on the table, a strange realization settled slowly into place. This dinner had never really been about dinner at all. My parents hadn't invited me here to catch up. They had invited me here because, in their minds, the problem of my life had finally found a solution. Standing there in the dining room with the contract lying on the table, a quiet realization settled into my mind. This dinner had never really been about dinner. My parents hadn't invited me here to talk, or catch up, or share a meal like we used to when I was younger. They had invited me because, in their minds, the biggest problem in my life had finally found a solution. And the truth was, this wasn't the first time my mother had tried to fix me. Patricia Carter had spent most of my adult life trying to guide my choices toward the version of success she understood. When I was younger, the pressure was subtle. She would bring it up casually while we cleaned the kitchen after Sunday lunch or folded laundry together. "You know," she would say thoughtfully, "your cousin Natalie met her husband through church. Sometimes you just have to put yourself in the right places." Back then, I didn't think much of it. I was 22, fresh out of college, trying to figure out how to pay rent, manage student loans, and survive my first full-time job. Marriage felt like something far away, something that belonged to a different stage of life. But for my mother, that timeline seemed to move faster every year. By the time I turned 25, the gentle suggestions had turned into something more deliberate. She started inviting unfamiliar men to family gatherings without warning me first. Sometimes they were sons of people from church. Sometimes they were distant relatives' co-workers who just happened to stop by during a barbecue. I would arrive expecting a normal afternoon and find myself sitting next to a man who already knew my name, my job, and my age. My mother always pretended the meetings were accidents. "Oh, you two should talk," she would say brightly while handing someone a plate of food. "You have so much in common." Then she would step away and watch from across the yard, pretending to refill drinks while quietly observing every conversation. The next morning she would call. "Well?" she would ask immediately. "Well, what?" I'd reply, even though I already knew the question. "What did you think of him?" she would press. "He's responsible, stable job. His family seems very respectable." When I told her I wasn't interested, she rarely argued outright. Instead, she sighed. It was a slow, disappointed sound that carried more weight than a lecture. "You're getting older, Emily," she would say softly. "You can't afford to be so selective forever." My father usually stayed out of those conversations, but occasionally he would add a single sentence that seemed to close the discussion before it even started. "Your mother's just trying to help." That word help became the explanation for everything. It turned pressure into concern and criticism into advice. If I resisted, it made me look unreasonable. As the years passed, the situation changed in ways that were harder to ignore. At family gatherings, my mother began speaking about my life like it was a problem that hadn't been solved yet. "Emily's always been a little independent," she would say to relatives, smiling politely. The word independent sounded harmless, but I knew what she meant. What she really meant was unpredictable, uncontrolled. Eventually, I started answering fewer of her calls. At first, it was small things, letting the phone ring while I finished dinner, or telling her I was busy with work when she wanted to talk. But distance, even a little distance, seemed to make her push harder. One evening about a year earlier, she showed up at my apartment without warning. I had just come home from work when someone knocked on the door. When I opened it, my mother stood in the hallway holding a small grocery bag like she had simply come by to drop something off. "I was nearby," she said, which made no sense because she had never had any reason to visit that part of town before. She stepped inside before I could respond and slowly looked around the apartment. Her eyes moved across the small couch, the narrow kitchen counter, and the stack of paperwork sitting on my table. "This place is very small," she finally said. "It's enough for me," I replied. She didn't argue. But the quiet look she gave me said everything. Standing in the dining room now, staring at the marriage contract waiting on the table, I finally understood something I hadn't fully admitted to myself before. For years, my mother hadn't simply been worried about my future. She had been trying to design it. And tonight, it looked like she believed she had finally finished the plan. Standing there in the dining room, staring at the marriage contract resting in the center of the table, I finally understood something that had been forming quietly in the back of my mind for years. My mother hadn't simply been worried about my future. She had been building towards something slowly, carefully, step by step, and somehow, without realizing it, I had been preparing for this moment too. About 2 years earlier, I started writing things down. At the time, it didn't feel like a big decision. It happened after one of those long phone calls with my mother that left me sitting in silence long after the line went dead. She had called that evening to ask why I hadn't attended a church dinner she had mentioned earlier in the week. Apparently, several families she considered very respectable had been there, and my absence had somehow embarrassed her. The conversation had wandered the way they always did. First, it was about the church event. Then it drifted toward my job. After that, it became about my apartment, and eventually about how people in town were starting to ask questions about why I was still alone. By the time we hung up, I wasn't even sure what we had originally been arguing about. I remember sitting at my small kitchen table, the overhead light humming faintly above me, feeling strangely unsettled. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something closer to confusion. Like the conversation had twisted in so many directions that I couldn't quite trace where it had started. That night, I opened the drawer beside my bed and pulled out a small spiral notebook I had once used for grocery lists. On the first page, I wrote the date. Then I wrote a short summary of the call. Just a few sentences, nothing dramatic. At the time, it felt almost silly, like I was documenting something that didn't really matter. But a few days later, another conversation happened, and then another. So I wrote those down too. At first, the notes were simple. March 14, Mom upset I didn't attend church dinner. April 2 asked why I'm still living alone. But after a while, I began to notice something. Many of our conversations followed the exact same pattern. They started with concern and slowly turned into criticism. My job wasn't stable enough. My apartment was too small. My friends were a bad influence. And somehow every discussion eventually circled back to the same conclusion that everything in my life would improve if I simply married the right man. The notebook began filling faster after that. Some entries were only a few lines long, others stretched across entire pages when the conversations lasted longer than usual. One evening I even printed out a message my mother had sent me after a family gathering and taped it into the notebook. "You made me look foolish today," the message said. "People were asking why you came alone again." Seeing the words written down like that made something shift in my mind. When the conversations happened in real time, they always left me feeling uncertain, like maybe I had misunderstood something or overreacted. But written on paper, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Over time, the notebook turned into a quiet record of everything that had been happening. Every phone call, every criticism, every small push toward the life my mother believed I should be living. I never showed it to anyone. At the time, I told myself it was just a way to organize my thoughts, a place to clear my head after conversations that left me feeling unsettled. But standing there now, looking at the marriage contract on the table, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. Without meaning to, I had been documenting the entire story. Across the table, the stranger shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his sleeve as if he were waiting for a meeting to begin. The candles flickered again, their light reflecting softly across the pages of the contract. My mother watched me with quiet patience. She seemed completely certain that sooner or later I would sit down, pick up the pen, and sign my name. But the longer I stood there, the more clearly I could see how all the small moments over the past 2 years had been leading to this exact scene. The phone calls, the pressure, the constant reminders that my life, as it was, wasn't acceptable. And resting quietly inside my purse was the same small notebook I had started filling 2 years earlier. Back then I thought I was writing it for myself. Now I was beginning to understand it might become something much more important than that. The thought stayed with me as I stood there in the dining room, the contract still lying untouched between the candles. For 2 years I had been writing things down in that small notebook, believing it was only a way to untangle the strange conversations I kept having with my mother. But the truth was that I hadn't walked into this dinner completely unaware, because 2 weeks earlier something had happened that made everything start to make sense. It began with a phone call from my cousin Laura, which was unusual on its own because Laura almost never called during the middle of the workday. When her name appeared on my phone that afternoon, I was sitting at my desk in the small accounting office of the trucking company where I worked, surrounded by delivery invoices and fuel reports. The office was quiet except for the soft whir of a printer and the distant rumble of trucks moving through the loading yard. I answered the phone expecting something simple, but the moment Laura spoke, I could hear something tense in her voice. She asked if I was somewhere private, and that question alone made my stomach tighten. I pushed my chair back, stepped outside through the side door of the office building, and walked across the gravel parking lot until I reached my car. The afternoon Texas sun hung bright above the highway, making the air shimmer with heat. When I told her I was alone, she paused for a moment before speaking again and asked me to listen carefully before saying anything. Laura had never been someone who exaggerated situations or spread gossip, so the seriousness in her voice immediately caught my attention. She explained that earlier that morning my mother had called her mother and had sounded unusually excited, almost proud, as if she had finally figured out the solution to something that had been bothering her for a long time. Then Laura repeated the words my mother had used. She said Mom told them she had finally solved the Emily problem. Hearing those words spoken out loud felt strange, almost unreal. I asked what she meant, and Laura explained that my parents were planning to host a dinner that coming Sunday night, and that, according to my mother, everything was already arranged. I remember watching a truck roll slowly past on the highway beyond the parking lot while she spoke, its engine fading into the distance as an ease inside my chest grew heavier. When I asked what exactly had been arranged, Laura hesitated before answering. She told me there was a man involved, someone named Victor Hale, a 41-year-old whose family owned a construction company just outside town. The name sounded familiar because in a small town certain families were impossible not to know. Laura continued carefully, explaining that according to my mother, the plan was for me to meet Victor at that dinner. Then she added the part that made everything suddenly feel different. She said my mother had also mentioned that an officiant would be there. For a moment I thought I had misunderstood her. An officiant implied something far more serious than a casual introduction. Laura then lowered her voice slightly and explained that my mother had said it was time for me to stop avoiding responsibility and start my life properly. Before I could respond, she added one final piece of information that made the entire situation click into place. Apparently, my father owed Victor's family a significant amount of money from a loan that had been supposed to be repaid months earlier, and according to my mother, this arrangement would solve that problem. For a long moment, I stood in the sunlight, staring across the empty gravel lot, feeling the pieces in my mind slowly begin to connect. The pressure my mother had been applying for years, the constant reminders that my life wasn't acceptable, the sudden urgency about marriage. Laura finally asked if I was still there and told me I didn't have to attend the dinner at all. She was right, of course. I didn't have to go. But as I stood there thinking about the certainty in my mother's voice and the plan she had apparently already set in motion, another thought quietly formed in my mind. If I didn't show up, my mother would control the entire story. But if I did go, I might finally see exactly what she had been planning all along. The idea settled into my mind during the quiet hours of that evening, growing clearer the longer I sat alone in my apartment. After hanging up with Laura, I had driven home almost automatically, barely noticing the familiar turns of the road or the fading light filtering through the tall pines along the highway. My thoughts kept replaying the conversation in fragments, her careful voice, the strange phrase my mother had used, the mention of an officiant waiting at a dinner that was supposed to be nothing more than a family meal. By the time I reached the narrow parking lot outside my building, the shock had begun to fade, replaced by something steadier. I unlocked my apartment, stepped inside, and let the quiet close around me. The place was small and simple, but it was mine, and the stillness of the room helped slow the rush of thoughts that had been building since the phone call. I sat down at the kitchen table where my notebook lay in the center, the same notebook I had been filling for 2 years, with small observations I had never expected anyone else to read. For a long moment, I simply looked at it without opening it, remembering the dozens of conversations that had led me to start writing things down in the first place. At the time, it had felt almost unnecessary, like I was documenting arguments that would eventually fade into memory. But as I finally flipped through the pages that night, the pattern was impossible to miss. Each entry captured a moment that had once seemed isolated, another phone call questioning my life choices, another conversation where my mother hinted that independence was only temporary, another reminder that she believed marriage would solve everything. Seen individually, those moments had always been easy to dismiss as ordinary family pressure. Seen together, they told a different story. The entries formed a timeline of steady escalation, a quiet buildup that had been leading somewhere long before I realized it. I turned page after page until I reached the most recent notes and closed the notebook again, letting my hands rest on the cover. The decision forming in my mind by then felt strangely calm. Refusing to attend the dinner would certainly stop the plan Laura had described, but it would also leave the entire story in my mother's hands. She would explain the situation to relatives and neighbors however she wanted, presenting the evening as a simple introduction that I had refused out of stubbornness or immaturity. In a town where reputation traveled faster than truth, her version would likely become the accepted one. That thought alone made the alternative feel clearer. If I went to the dinner, I would see everything for myself. I would hear exactly how my parents intended to present the situation and how much of it had been decided without my knowledge. More importantly, I would be able to respond in the moment rather than chasing rumors afterward. The longer I considered it, the more certain I became that avoiding the confrontation would only delay it. Eventually, my mother would try again, perhaps with a different approach, but the same expectation that I would eventually accept the role she had chosen for me. Sitting there in the quiet apartment, I realized that the only way to end the cycle was to face it directly. By the time the evening grew late and the lights from the neighboring buildings flickered on outside my window, my decision had settled completely. I would attend the dinner exactly as planned. I would walk into the house, take my seat at the table, and listen carefully to whatever explanation they had prepared. But this time I would not walk in confused or uncertain the way my mother expected. I would walk in aware of what she had been building toward and ready to see how far she intended to push it. And if she truly believed the evening would end with me quietly accepting a decision that had already been made for me, then she was about to learn just how much she had underestimated her own daughter. Sunday evening arrived slowly, stretching out in that quiet, tense way time sometimes does when you know something important is waiting ahead of you. I spent most of the afternoon in my apartment moving through small, ordinary routines that normally would have felt automatic, washing a cup in the sink, straightening the living room, folding a jacket over the back of a chair, but every few minutes my thoughts drifted back to the dinner my parents had arranged. The conversation with Laura kept replaying in my mind, each detail settling more clearly the longer I sat with it. By late afternoon, the sunlight had softened into a warm glow that spread across the floor of the apartment, and the stillness of the room made everything feel unusually calm. Eventually, I stood from the couch and walked to the bedroom to get ready. I chose a simple dark blue dress from the closet, something neat and appropriate for a family dinner but plain enough that it wouldn't draw attention. As I dressed, I noticed how steady my breathing felt compared to the restless uncertainty I had experienced earlier in the week. The anxiety had gradually been replaced by something more controlled, almost deliberate. Before leaving, I walked back to the kitchen table, where the notebook still rested in the center. I opened it briefly, glancing over the last few entries I had written the previous night. For a moment I considered adding another note about the dinner, but instead I closed the cover and slipped the notebook into my bag. Carrying it with me felt strangely grounding, like bringing a quiet witness to whatever conversation might unfold that evening. When I finally stepped outside, the sky had begun shifting into the deep blue of early evening, and a cool breeze moved through the trees lining the street. The drive to my parents' house took about 20 minutes, following the same highway I had traveled countless times over the years. The road passed through long stretches of pine trees before opening into the residential neighborhood where I had grown up, and as the familiar streets came into view, I felt an unexpected wave of memories rise to the surface. Holiday dinners at the same table, my father teaching me to ride a bicycle in the driveway, my mother calling me in from the yard when dinner was ready. Those moments felt distant now, like memories from a different version of the house. When I turned onto my parents' street, the porch light was already glowing beside the front door, casting a soft yellow circle across the steps. My mother had always turned that light on when expecting guests, a small gesture meant to make the house look welcoming from the outside. I parked along the curb and sat for a moment with the engine running, looking at the familiar shape of the house. Nothing about the exterior suggested anything unusual. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the curtains drawn just the way they always were in the evening, and the quiet neighborhood looked exactly as it had every time I had visited before. Eventually, I turned off the engine, stepped out of the car, and walked up the short path leading to the porch. The air had cooled slightly, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and distant wood smoke from somewhere down the street. I paused briefly at the door, steadying my breath before knocking. A few seconds later, the door opened and my mother appeared with the same bright, practiced smile she used whenever greeting visitors. For a moment, her expression flickered with relief, as if she had half expected me not to show up. Then the familiar composure returned to her face. "Emily," she said warmly, stepping aside to let me enter. "I'm so glad you came." I stepped inside, the familiar scent of the house wrapping around me as the door closed behind my back. The living room looked unchanged, but the dining area immediately drew my attention. The table had been carefully prepared with white plates, folded napkins, and a small arrangement of flowers placed neatly in the center. Sitting quietly in one of the chairs, watching me with calm, measured interest, was the man Laura had warned me about, Victor Hale. Victor Hale stood up the moment I stepped fully into the dining room, as if my arrival had been the signal he had been waiting for. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who was used to being taken seriously the instant he entered a room. Up close, he looked slightly older than I expected, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark jacket over a neatly pressed shirt that felt more appropriate for a business meeting than a family dinner. His expression was calm and controlled, but his eyes followed me carefully, studying me with the kind of focus that suggested this moment had been planned long before I ever walked through the door. "Emily," he said, extending his hand toward me with a polite nod. His voice was steady, smooth, practiced. "It's good to finally meet you." The word finally lingered in the air for a second longer than it should have, as if our meeting had always been expected rather than arranged without my knowledge. I shook his hand briefly, noticing the firmness of his grip and the faint smell of cedar from his cologne, then released it and took in the rest of the room. My father stood near the kitchen doorway with his arms folded across his chest, watching everything with the same quiet stillness he brought to most situations. His expression gave nothing away. My mother, meanwhile, moved around the table, adjusting napkins that were already perfectly aligned, her bright smile stretched just a little too wide as she tried to make the scene feel ordinary. "Now that everyone's here," she said brightly, clapping her hands once in a small gesture of satisfaction, "we can sit down." Her tone carried the easy enthusiasm of someone hosting a pleasant dinner party, but the room felt too controlled, too carefully arranged to be casual. I took the chair across from Victor and set my bag on the floor beside me while my parents settled into their seats at opposite ends of the table. For a moment the room grew quiet, and it was only then that I noticed the detail that made the situation feel even stranger. The table had been fully set with plates, glasses, folded napkins, and a small arrangement of white flowers in the center, yet there was no food anywhere in sight, no serving dishes waiting in the kitchen, no smell of something cooking. The table looked less like a dinner setting and more like a stage prepared for a conversation. My mother folded her hands neatly in front of her and looked at me with the same calm smile she had worn when opening the door. "Emily," she began in a gentle voice, "we wanted tonight to be something meaningful." I met her gaze without responding, letting her continue. "Victor comes from a very respected family," she went on, speaking slowly as though she had rehearsed every word. "They've built a strong business here in the county, and they believe in stability, responsibility, and long-term commitment." As she spoke, Victor leaned back slightly in his chair, listening without interrupting. His posture relaxed in a way that suggested he had already heard this explanation before. My father remained silent, his attention fixed on the table as though the conversation unfolding around him had nothing to do with him. My mother continued describing Victor's family, their construction company, the opportunities that came with joining a family so established in the community. The speech sounded less like an introduction and more like a presentation, the kind of explanation someone might offer when discussing a partnership agreement rather than a relationship between two people. Eventually she paused and turned toward Victor, giving him a small, encouraging nod. He returned the nod before looking back at me. "I appreciate you coming tonight," he said calmly. "I know arrangements like this can feel unexpected at first." The choice of words confirmed what I had already suspected. This evening was not meant to be a simple dinner. It was a negotiation. I rested my hands lightly on the table and allowed a small silence to settle before speaking. "Unexpected is one way to describe it," I said evenly. My mother's smile tightened for a brief second before returning. Without another word, she reached beside her plate and lifted a thin stack of papers that had been resting just out of sight. The soft sound of the pages sliding across the table seemed unusually loud in the quiet room as she placed them carefully in the center, between Victor and me. She smoothed the top page with her fingertips as if presenting something important. "We thought it would be best if everything was clear from the beginning," she said gently. I lowered my eyes to the page and immediately saw the bold heading printed across the top. It wasn't a menu or an introduction. It was a contract, laid neatly on the table as though the decision it represented had already been made. And in that moment, the true purpose of the evening became impossible to ignore. For a moment I simply looked at the document resting in the center of the table, the printed letters sharp and unmistakable under the warm light of the dining room. The word contract sat boldly at the top of the page, followed by several neatly organized paragraphs of legal language that made the purpose of the paper immediately clear. I didn't reach for it right away. Instead, I let my eyes move slowly across the table, first to Victor, who watched me with the calm patience of someone accustomed to negotiations, then to my mother, whose posture remained upright and composed, her hands folded neatly together, as though everything unfolding was perfectly reasonable. My father remained silent near the end of the table, his gaze lowered slightly, the same quiet presence he had maintained throughout the entire evening. The room felt unusually still, the silence stretching just long enough for the moment to grow heavier. Finally, I reached forward and lifted the first page. The paper was thicker than ordinary printer paper, the kind used for formal agreements, and the weight of it in my hands felt strangely symbolic. As I scanned the opening lines, the structure of the document became clearer. It outlined a formal arrangement between two families, referencing financial obligations, shared responsibilities, and a long-term union intended to benefit both sides involved. The wording was polite, almost clinical, but the meaning behind it was impossible to misinterpret. My parents had not invited me to dinner for a conversation or an introduction. They had invited me to finalize a decision they believed had already been made. I lowered the page slightly and looked across the table at my mother. "You wrote this?" I asked calmly. Her smile returned immediately, warm and reassuring in a way that might have comforted someone who hadn't already heard Laura's warning. "Victor's family lawyer prepared the document," she replied smoothly. "But we all agreed it would be the best solution." Solution. The word hung quietly in the air between us. Victor leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table as if stepping into the conversation at exactly the moment he had planned. "I know this probably feels sudden," he said in a measured tone, "but arrangements like this have a long tradition. When families work together, everyone benefits." His voice carried the calm certainty of someone who viewed the entire situation as practical rather than personal. I glanced back down at the contract, turning to the next page. More terms followed: housing arrangements, financial commitments, timelines that stretched years into the future. Every detail had been considered with careful precision. What the document didn't include anywhere was a single line asking what I wanted. "You didn't think it might have been worth mentioning this to me before tonight?" I asked quietly. My mother's expression softened slightly, the same sympathetic look she had used countless times while explaining decisions she believed were already settled. "Emily," she said gently, "we knew you might react emotionally if we told you too soon. We wanted you to see the opportunity clearly before making assumptions." Opportunity. I almost laughed at the word, but the calm I had been carrying all evening held steady. Across the table, Victor watched me closely, his gaze careful and analytical, like a businessman observing a negotiation that had reached an important turning point. "The arrangement solves several issues," he added. "Your father's situation, for example." My eyes shifted slowly toward my father. For the first time that evening, he looked up slightly, though he still didn't speak. The silence confirmed what Laura had already told me. The debt was real. The contract wasn't just a suggestion, it was a transaction. I placed the paper back down on the table, aligning it carefully with the edge of the flowers in the center. "So," I said quietly, looking from my mother to Victor, "you've all already decided how my future works." My mother nodded once, as though the matter were obvious. "We believe it's the right path." The calm certainty in her voice made something inside me settle even further, because in that moment, it became clear that none of them expected the answer I had already decided to give. For a few seconds after the words left my mouth, the entire room went completely still. The sentence itself had been simple, calm, quiet, almost gentle, but the effect it had on the table was immediate. My mother's smile froze in place, not disappearing but tightening slightly at the corners, as if the muscles of her face were deciding whether they should hold the expression or let it fall. Victor didn't move at all at first. He simply watched me, the same steady, analytical look in his eyes, as though he were recalculating a number in the middle of a negotiation that had suddenly shifted in an unexpected direction. My father was the first person who reacted in a visible way. His shoulders lifted slightly as he inhaled, and for the first time that evening he looked directly at me rather than at the table. The contract still lay open in front of me, the pen resting beside it exactly where my mother had placed it earlier. The pages were perfectly straight, the formal language printed across them as if the document itself had never imagined the possibility that the answer might be no. My mother recovered first. The smile returned to her face, though now it carried a faint edge of disbelief. "Emily," she said softly, leaning forward a little as if speaking to someone who had misunderstood a simple instruction, "I think you may be reacting too quickly. You should take a little more time to read through everything carefully." Her voice had that familiar tone she used when she believed I simply needed guidance toward the right decision. "I did read it," I replied calmly. My hands rested lightly on the table, fingers relaxed. "That's why I said no." Victor finally shifted in his chair. The movement was subtle, but it broke the stillness around him. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table again. "Emily," he said, his voice measured and composed, "it's natural to feel hesitant at first. Agreements like this can seem abrupt if you weren't involved in the earlier discussions. But if you take a moment to consider the long-term benefits, the benefits for who?" I asked quietly. The question interrupted him just long enough for a small silence to settle across the table. Victor studied me carefully before answering. "For everyone involved," he said. "Your father's situation would be resolved, your future would be secure, and both families would gain stability." Across from me, My mother nodded gently, as if reinforcing his point. Exactly, she added. We're trying to make sure you're taken care of. I glanced briefly toward my father again. He hadn't spoken yet, but his hands had curled slightly against the surface of the table, the knuckles pale with tension. The weight of the debt hung in the room even without anyone naming the number. Taken care of, I repeated quietly. The phrase sounded familiar because I had heard it so many times over the years whenever my mother described the life she believed I should have. I reached forward and slid the contract a few inches back toward the center of the table. The paper moved smoothly across the polished wood, stopping between Victor and my mother. I understand what you're trying to do, I said, but you're talking about my life like it's a financial solution. My mother's expression hardened slightly at that. Emily, don't be dramatic. No one is forcing you into anything unreasonable. Victor is offering you stability, security, a future most people would be grateful for. Victor remained silent, watching the exchange with the same careful patience he had shown since I arrived. I shook my head once, slowly. You're not hearing what I'm saying. My voice remained calm, but the certainty behind it had settled into place completely now. This isn't about whether Victor is respectable or whether the arrangement helps Dad. It's about the fact that none of you ever asked me if I wanted this. For a moment, the room felt smaller, the air heavier with the tension that had been building since the moment I walked through the door. My mother opened her mouth as if preparing another explanation, but before she could speak again, I pushed my chair back from the table and stood. The movement was quiet but decisive. I'm not signing the contract, I said again, this time with no room left for negotiation. And I'm not part of whatever agreement the rest of you decided to make without me. My chair scraped softly against the floor as I stood, the sound cutting through the quiet dining room more sharply than I expected. For a moment, no one spoke. My mother remained seated, her hands still folded on the table, but the calm expression she had been holding all evening began to slip. Victor watched me carefully, the same analytical look still in his eyes, though now there was something else mixed into it, uncertainty perhaps, or the realization that the conversation had moved somewhere he had not planned for. My father shifted in his seat but still said nothing. The silence between the four of us stretched long enough that I could hear the faint ticking of the clock mounted on the wall in the hallway. Emily, my mother said finally, her voice lower now, the polite warmth gone from it. Sit down. It wasn't a request. It was the same tone she had used when I was younger, the one that assumed obedience would follow automatically. I didn't sit. I'm leaving, I said instead. Her expression hardened immediately. You are not walking out of this house in the middle of an important conversation. This isn't a conversation, I replied calmly. It's a decision you made without me. Across the table, Victor straightened slightly in his chair. His hands came together in front of him, fingers interlaced in a controlled gesture that suggested he was trying to restore the order he believed the situation should have. Emily, he said carefully, no one here is trying to trap you. Your parents believed this arrangement would benefit everyone involved. Perhaps we simply approached it too quickly. The word quickly almost made me laugh. 2 years of pressure had led to this dinner, yet somehow it was still being described as something sudden. I picked up my bag from the floor beside my chair and slipped the strap over my shoulder. The small movement seemed to alarm my mother more than anything else I had said. Emily Carter, she said sharply, rising from her seat. You need to think very carefully about what you're doing. I looked at her. For years, that warning had worked. It had always been followed by long explanations about responsibility, reputation, and the importance of family decisions. But standing there now, with the contract still lying untouched on the table, the meaning behind her words felt clearer than it ever had before. I have thought about it, I said. My father finally spoke. His voice was quiet, rougher than I expected. Emily, this situation is more complicated than you understand. I turned toward him. For the first time that evening, he wasn't avoiding my eyes. How much? I asked. The question seemed to land heavily in the room. My mother immediately stepped in. That's not something you need to concern yourself with. Yes, it is, I replied, because apparently I'm the payment. Victor shifted again, his composure beginning to crack at the edges. Your father made a business investment that didn't work out, he said. My family helped stabilize the situation. This arrangement simply ensures that everyone's interests remain protected. Protected. The word sounded strangely cold in the quiet room. My father looked down again, his hands tightening on the edge of the table. It wasn't supposed to turn into this, he muttered. For a moment I felt a brief flicker of sympathy for him, but it passed quickly, because the contract still lay in the center of the table, and every line of it had been written without my voice. "I'm sorry you're in trouble," I said quietly, "but you don't get to solve it with my life." My mother's patience finally snapped. "You're being unbelievably selfish," she said, her voice rising. "Families make sacrifices for each other. That's how the world works." I met her gaze evenly. "No," I said, "that's how control works." The words hung in the air between us. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension in the room felt almost physical now, like the air had thickened around the table. Then Victor slowly leaned back in his chair, studying me with a different expression than before. Not frustration, recognition. As if he had finally realized something my parents hadn't, that the outcome of this dinner was no longer something they could decide for me. Victor's expression changed slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the silence stretched across the dining room. The confident certainty he had carried since I arrived seemed to settle into something quieter, more observant. My mother, however, was not ready to accept the shift in the room. She remained standing beside the table, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on me with the same determined intensity she had used throughout my entire life whenever she believed I was making the wrong decision. For a moment, it looked as though she was searching for the exact words that would restore the control she was used to having. When she spoke again, her voice was sharper, the calm politeness from earlier completely gone. "You're making a mistake," she said. "You're throwing away stability because you're too stubborn to see what's right in front of you." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked around the room one last time. The dining table was still set perfectly, the white flowers in the center untouched, the contract resting between the plates exactly where my mother had placed it earlier. The entire evening had been carefully arranged down to the smallest detail, every part designed to lead to a single outcome. What none of them had accounted for was the possibility that I might simply refuse to follow the script. My father finally stood from his chair. The movement was slow, heavy, as if the weight of the evening had settled into his shoulders. For a moment I thought he might try to stop me from leaving, but instead he only looked at the contract lying on the table. "Lorraine," he said quietly to my mother, using her name in a way that felt unusually formal. "This isn't going to work." She turned toward him immediately. "Of course it will work if she just stops being dramatic for 5 minutes." "It won't," he repeated. His voice wasn't loud, but there was something final in it. "You can't force something like this." My mother stared at him as though she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Victor remained seated, his attention moving slowly between the three of us. The tension that had filled the room all evening had changed now, shifting from pressure into something closer to realization. I picked up my bag and stepped away from the table. No one tried to stop me this time. The house felt strangely quiet as I walked toward the front door, the familiar hallway suddenly seeming smaller than I remembered. When I reached the door, I paused briefly, my hand resting on the handle. Behind me I could still hear the faint sounds of movement in the dining room chairs shifting, my mother's frustrated voice beginning to rise again, but I didn't turn back. Outside, the night air felt cool and open compared to the tension inside the house. The porch light cast a soft circle across the steps as I walked down to the driveway. My car was still parked along the curb exactly where I had left it, the street around it quiet and empty. For a moment I stood there looking back at the house where I had grown up. From the outside, it looked exactly the same as it always had. Calm, ordinary, the porch light glowing warmly beside the door. No one passing by would ever guess what had just happened inside. I unlocked my car and sat behind the wheel, letting the quiet settle around me before starting the engine. The evening had not gone the way my parents expected, but strangely, I didn't feel angry. What I felt instead was something steadier, something clearer than anything I had experienced in years. For so long I had been reacting to the pressure around me, explaining my choices, defending my life, trying to convince my mother that independence didn't mean failure. Tonight, for the first time, I hadn't argued at all. I had simply said no. The engine started with a low hum, and I pulled away from the curb, the porch light shrinking in the rearview mirror as the car moved down the quiet street. The road ahead stretched into the darkness, the familiar highway waiting just beyond the neighborhood. I didn't know exactly what would happen next, how my parents would respond, what new conversations might follow, but one thing had become certain. For the first time in my life, the direction of my future was no longer being negotiated across someone else's table. It was mine to decide. Life lesson from the story. This story reminds us of an important truth about family, responsibility, and personal boundaries. Love and loyalty to family should never mean losing control of your own life. Emily's parents believed they were solving a problem, financial trouble, and social expectations by making a decision for her. But in doing so, they treated her future like a transaction rather than a choice. The most powerful moment in the story is not the argument or the contract. It is the simple moment when Emily calmly says, "No." The first lesson is that your life is not a negotiation between other people. Even when family members believe they are acting in your best interest, they do not have the right to decide your future without your consent. Respect and love within a family should include listening, understanding, and allowing each person to make their own choices. The second lesson is the importance of recognizing manipulation disguised as care. Emily's mother repeatedly framed the arrangement as stability, security, and opportunity. Those words sounded positive, but they were used to pressure Emily into accepting something she never wanted. In real life, people sometimes hide control behind the language of protection. Learning to recognize that difference is an important step in protecting your independence. Another key lesson is the power of calm boundaries. Emily didn't shout, panic, or lose control. She listened, understood the situation, and then clearly stated her decision. Setting boundaries does not always require anger or confrontation. Sometimes the strongest response is quiet clarity, knowing what you will and will not accept. The story also highlights the danger of solving problems by sacrificing someone else's freedom. Emily's father's financial mistake created pressure within the family, but that responsibility was never hers to carry. Real solutions require honesty and accountability, not transferring the consequences onto someone else. Finally, the story teaches that courage often appears in small moments. Emily didn't change the world in one dramatic act. She simply refused to sign a paper that would have taken away her freedom. Yet that single decision changed the direction of her entire life. Many people face moments like this, times when they must choose between keeping peace with others or staying true to themselves. The most important takeaway for viewers is simple. You are allowed to choose your own life. Respect for family, culture, or tradition should never come at the cost of your freedom to decide who you are, what you value, and the path you want to follow. True support from others should empower your choices, not replace them.